Brian Darmody, CEO for Association of University Research Parks. I want to welcome you to our weekly peer-to-peer meeting. We have special guests this time, and I'm speaking to you from the WeWork in College Park, Maryland. You can see my AURP sponsor board here. Thank you all for sponsors, including Perkins and Will, which is here on our sponsor board. And our guests today are from Perkins and Will. So we have Stephen Colston, who's the principal with Urban Design Practice and leader and Innovation District Specialist, coming to us from Austin, Texas. And his colleague, Jessica Feigenholz, I hope I got that right, Jessica, who's an associate principal with a higher education practice in Chicago for Perkins and Will. So we got Chicago and Austin represented, and they have an actual formal presentation with some slides. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues from Perkins and Will to lead a discussion about reopening and techniques and strategies and related policy issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to Perkins and Will.
Thank you very much, Brian. Yes, so we're happy to have the opportunity to join you today. And this was kind of an interesting timing conversation for us because we have our firm and a lot of the different areas of our practice have been in a very much a deep dive focus around what we've been considering on the horizon associated with the implications of what's going on with COVID and what that looks like from a planning, future forward perspective. One of the first areas in our that we really dove into was the return to workplace. Like, how do we actually start getting back to work? Realize this has implications across all the different areas that we work, and we've gone into some deep areas of analysis around healthcare and research facilities and higher education and K through 12 and all the different scenarios, all of which have a lot of great cross-pollination. And as we were contacted a few weeks ago by Greg Deason and asked if we would be willing to come speak with his research foundation board at Purdue and share a little bit of our thoughts on this. So this is a little bit of a reprisal of some of the work that we've been doing and that we also shared with our board that we kind of customized to focus on some of the facility types that are most apropos to our research park environments. And what's interesting is we started thinking about the mashup of what we see in a lot of the innovation ecosystems right now. All of the different work that we practice in as a design firm are the kinds of things that we sort of see in the most vibrant innovation ecosystems, right? They're the office, so it hits workplace, but we also might have health, and there's all the things associated with our biocaucus and the research that happens in health-related facilities. Core bench research, applied research, R&D, in basic research and everything in between. All the workforce development stuff that happens in education and training, and then all the mixed use of everything that happens with residential and hospitality and retail, all kind of come together. And so we kind of mixed the conversations because we realized for research parks it's kind of not a one size fits all. So we're going to just run through kind of a brief presentation. What we'd like to do is to get this back to more of the peer-and-peer Q&A, but we thought this might, we shared a little bit of some of the research that we've been doing and might be a little bit of springboard for food for thought for discourse. So a lot of you know our firm, we're longtime supporters of AURP, very active on different committees and roles and speaking engagements. We think that innovation and the stuff, the principles that align with AURP very much align with ours as an innovation design firm. We have a lot of focus in the areas of research, and we've also been recognized for the areas that that I lead in our region around urban design and planning for excellence in that regard. So joining me today is Jessica, who's my colleague and partner in arms in our Chicago office, as Brian mentioned, who leads our higher education practice. And we're going to kind of walk through a little bit of kind of the planning and of a phased return to how we think about returning to the research park, and then some of the considerations around physical distancing and behaviors, and then do a little bit deeper dive into just conversations around kind of R&D and manufacturing kinds of spaces. And I mentioned some of the return to work that we've been doing. One of the collaborations that Jessica and I have been working on with our global higher ed practice has been some of the return to campus roadmap, which is, and we'd be happy to share that with any of you guys that are interested. It looks at everything from overall campus planning perspective, all the way down to the specialized areas of, libraries and learning commons and health science and medical education and even recreation and sports activities and everything in between, as universities kind of make up little microcosms of communities. So kind of planning for this phased return really is kind of is something that I think all of us on this call have been really wrapping our brains around, which is this notion of all the different phases of the pandemic. And what we've realized is this has not been a straight upward curve and a straight downward curve. There's not just this linear line that we can project out and understand what the implications are going to be at any point in time. We're just talking right before everyone was beginning to join how each of our states are respectively coming up with their phased incremental approaches to reopening and what that means. And we're really all looking forward. We're happy that Vicki has her fingernails polished now, and we're looking forward to Brian having a haircut. But the reality is everything's not going to be created equal. And as everybody's coming back and, coming together in large masses of Memorial Day gatherings and everything, we don't know what the implications might be of echoes or recurrences or bumps in the road moving forward. We don't know exactly what the implications might be as we move back into the fall, whether we see some recurrences. So we've been trying to think about this whole continuum in a very deliberate way about how we think in terms of response and transition and preparation for the unknown as we move forward, and really manage the risk throughout those processes. So with that, let me transition over to you, Jessica, and you can kind of walk us through a little bit about how we've been thinking about this in terms of a return roadmap.
Great, thanks, Stephen. I think that when all of us were sheltered in place at the beginning of March and kind of went through those first couple of weeks of being in a pandemic, really started to think now what's next and what are the outcomes. And so as you saw from the World Health Organization on that previous slide, the phases of a pandemic, now how do we begin to overlay that into categories for campuses and for Research Park and what that might look like returning to work? So we have three categories: this work location, who is working remotely and who is working in the office; operations, how will we work when we're in the office; and behaviors and messages, what are the key messages during this time and what alternate behaviors are they supporting? So I think today's conversation is really focusing on these three categories, and they will be occurring at phased times, and they'll look different the first couple of weeks after you're in that situation for the next couple of months of re-entry. And I think what's key is to really think about reinforce lessons learned from the response and the transition phases, because that will really strengthen the workplace and co-working spaces once we're back on campuses. And the question is not always of when to return, but how to plan the return. So I'm sure several of you are already have been engaged in conversations for weeks now of what this might look like. And a couple of key things to think about is the office capacity. And what does that look like for your building holistically, but also floor by floor, accordance with the CDC guidelines. Talking to your employees and communicating that it's not mandatory to have to come back on day one, knowing that there are a lot of critical components. What is the protocol of messaging? And really leading with compassion. I think that many of us have a lot of things going on in our personal life that will be impacting us professionally. So what does that look like? And what are these new behaviors? What is going to be the new norm? And when we also think about how folks are reentering your research parks, innovation districts, and campuses, it's not just once they're in the physical space, but how are they getting there? How are they commuting? Is it public transit? Is it within their own cars? Even, I think we had the conversation a little bit earlier about elevators. Here in Chicago, they're actually entertaining the idea of having elevator escorts again, all of the early 1920s, when people are managing who goes up in the elevator, how many, and are they facing forward, are they facing out? And is there a dedicated elevator for immune compromised individuals? So thinking through these strategies of the whole life cycle, the whole journey of an individual from their home, at workplace, and back. So even if the workplace is ready, our employees, and I touched on that a little bit, is that all employees will not have the same comfort level about returning to an office. They may not have the same ability to return to work as they did pre-COVID due to about availability of childcare options, the need to care for individuals who might be sick, or they might have compromised immune systems. So messaging really needs to be clear that there's no consequence for choosing to delay your return to the office for any reason, and that there should be a cadence set when you're asking for volunteers, knowing that if it's every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, that if the first 2-week time cycle, they don't feel comfortable, they know they have another opportunity in a month or so, or whatever that cadence is, to re-engage and know that that's the right time for them to enter back. So physical distance analysis. There's several graphs that we'll be sharing, and I think we'll be sharing this deck afterwards so you can look at them closely. But there are currently no guidelines for how many people to phase into an office beyond the CDC required 6-foot social distancing requirement. So based on that criteria, it's a simple calculation. But what it is important to note with these calculations is that when you are doing them is to establish a max capacity for each floor instead of the building holistically. That is to really ensure that shared spaces are distributed equally and fairly throughout the building, and so they're not overwhelmed. And so I think that's just one caveat we always like to share, because that really does make a difference when you're thinking through floor, through the various programs and the various components that you have within your buildings. So the guidance is to maintain 6 feet. So you're analyzing circle needs to have a 6-foot radius, not a 6-foot diameter. And that's critical to get correct. And maintain 6 foot in all directions from the stationary position. So when we start looking at private offices are analyzed in a similar way to workstations, it's useful to understand where the monitors are set up in each private office so that that circle can accurately reflect the typical working position. And also, when in doubt, limit the number of people in a room. An enclosed room will not have the same ventilation as an open office, so tight quarters should be considered carefully, and remove guest seating if possible to ensure that the maximum number of occupants is followed. And access to workstations is unique because maintaining a 6-foot distance when walking in between back-to-back co-working stations is a challenge. Maintaining a 6-foot distance walking around the corridor is a challenge. So being aware of your surroundings is imperative in these situations, and also thinking through protocol. Are you requiring PPE gear to be worn throughout the day until you are settled in your workstation? This goes to protocols, which we'll talk about in a little bit later, messaging and protocols and space. And meeting rooms. Our initial analysis on meeting rooms was surprising that we did not have nearly as many occupiable seats as we would have guessed. So small conference rooms are a bit challenging. And remember that most guidance is that there's no more than 10 people to gather, even if the room can hold more at 6-foot distancing. And then also looking at just social distancing guidelines at shared areas. These blue lines begin to mark 6-foot spacing, similar to what you'd be seeing, I'm sure, in your grocery stores at Target today. And placing this floor guidance does make people pause and think and how they should be circulating throughout the space. Also looking, I'm sure some of your spaces have cafes on the first floor. And so there might be an increase in space needed for more grab and go and prepackaged food versus having shared utensils or food or shared food out. So keeping this service area open needs to be weighed with your protocols and high touch areas and high trafficking areas. And with reception areas, Really thinking through the guests that are coming in, how many guests you're allowing, where they're coming from. Do you need to consider a shield guard for protection? And also, what are the protocols put in place for guests? Do you offer them their own PPE if they don't have their own? Do you provide temperature checks? Is there a guest sanitizing station, or do they use a separate washroom from your staff that's within the building? Those two just different things to consider. And behaviors and messaging. So concurrently to thinking through the physical space, needing to consider strategies to allow the building to operate at its appropriate capacity, but as well as the comfort level for your staff. And this could be something as alternating days where you have a group come in Mondays and Wednesdays and another group coming Tuesdays and Thursdays. And Friday the office is closed so that it is allowed its deep cleaning over the weekend for the next group. Do you work in shifts and having folks come in early and others come in late? I think it's really thinking through what works best for your teams and your building, but also minimizing the amount of shared space, trying not to share desks or sharing computers and other utensils. And that's really something that is difficult, as I think many of us have seen our workplace transition towards that. And it's these new behaviors. Individual actions within the workplace are still the most important. So posting signs around in select spots is key, but making sure that it doesn't overwhelm them so that they just ignore it. So the CDC, that link in the bottom right, does have pre-written posters you can download and print to help reinforce these behaviors, which if they can get into this rhythm when they're in the office, hopefully it'll continue when they're out of the office. And also continuing to leverage the new behaviors. When I talked about lessons learned, what are the good things that have come out of this? I think many of you, I'm sure as I have myself, have become more skilled at virtual meetings and virtual communication. So what is the comfort level with work from home and in-person collaboration sessions, and making sure that policies almost always have that virtual option available so that there's an equity in your meetings, there's an equity in collaboration, and making sure that nobody's left out. And also providing training as needed. So hope that was a lot of information fast. I apologize.
Yeah. Well, it's good. I know you guys have lots of different thoughts around this. Thank you very much, Jessica. It's been fascinating, and I'm sure this is probably what all of your restrooms look like at all of your facilities. So immaculate and wonderful as well. We've been joking amongst ourselves that we're probably liable to have some of the most clean restroom facilities in all of our buildings as we move forward, as everybody's being so sensitive about the contamination factors. But so one of the things that we've been talking to, and my colleague Ed Cordes and I spent a good bit of time talking just about the R&D environment and manufacturing and what some of the most near and immediate impacts have been on the research and manufacturing sectors. And you know, you guys are aware of all these. We've seen slowdowns because just like everything else in our economy, our basic research is just shut down or slowed significantly. You know, the PIs are working from home, so they're not in the labs. The technicians are working from home, they're not in the labs, and they're not supporting the PI work. If we do have any operations, they're kind of down to the skeleton crews that are, you know, just running the Vivaria or something along those lines. The consumptions are really quite low because the consumables are just not in demand, whether it's mice or chemicals or gowns or other disposables that might be needed. And most notably is just the pipeline associated with the fact that because human trials have essentially been largely suspended during this time frame, which has an impact due to the quarantine in a lot of different medical device prototypes that could be, you know, from electronics to implantables to probes, that because people are just not physically in the environments, you know, just like the heart surgeon who was doing 25 procedures a week and had all the staff supporting them, who was not proceeding, you know, doing any of those for the preceding, you know, couple of months. So that implication has some real disruptions in the cycle overall. As we kind of thought about, you know, what some of the general considerations are as it relates to how do we transition back and what some of the concerns may be, One is that any repopulation strategy needs to be very thoughtful and phased, and it needs to be customized to the unique environments that each of you are in within your research parks. And as we thought about how you begin to come back into the workplace, that there are going to be some systems recertification that are quite likely to need to occur. If you've had, idle fume hoods or biosafety cabinets and clean rooms that require certification systems that have been not been under that same level of maintenance and rigor and control, there may be a time lapse in there that you need to be factoring into reoccupation. And another important factor is, as we were just talking about, as we were alluding to those consumables, because those have not been occurring, there's the possibility there could be disruption in the supply chain, whether it has to do with the animal models, whether it has to be with disposable plastics or gases. How long does it take that supply chain to, quote unquote, normalize to get us back into a fully operating system? You should be thinking into your redundancy strategies and how you move those forward. So in terms of research environments specifically, one of the key takeaways is, unlike some of the social distancing that we look at as we've been considering spaces like classroom spaces and the university setting, or open office spaces or closed office or conference room spaces, where we're trying to encourage the opportunities for social distancing aligned with the interpretations of the CDC guidelines, we really may not have that same flexibility in the research environment. And so the repopulation of those could be quite different than the general office space. And part of that is due in no small part because of just the high cost of construction of the facilities and the infrastructure supporting what you have in the research spaces. So the whole idea of creating major social distancing between your researchers just becomes financially unviable because the space and the equipment is just fundamentally so expensive. The lab and the HVAC systems, from a positive perspective, in many cases do have superior indoor air quality systems where they're, at least if they've been built within the last 25 or 30 years, they're doing, single pass outside air. Those are frequently being exchanged at 6 to 12 times per hour. And so there's a higher likelihood that these environments may be better set up for dealing with some of these transitionary, and concerns about isolation that we might not of a virus that we might not otherwise see in a general office space or shared common space. The idea for having some physical and operational modifications is probably going to be more fundamental than the social distancing approach. So these can be some basic modifications that happen at the bench, like some of these examples that are sort of shown off here to the side, the lab bench panels that, there have been some of these that have been like aerosol separations with plexiglass add-ons that can be put in so that you can actually have workers that are there. But the workers also need to have, be using PPE in a very deliberate way, and there needs to be a proactive policy enforcement around that. In some cases, it may be beyond just using face masks, but may also include face shields. It may include gowns. It may include gloves and other things, including temperature monitoring as you come into into the research environment. And the real driver behind why you may not just be able to socially distance in a lab may have to do with just the way that your real estate obligations are set up in terms of any research grant funding that you might have. So if you're doing NSF or NIH or other kind of industry funded research that has that indirect cost recovery tied into its grant support, then those are going to be tied to your lab space allocations. And if your grant dollar amounts are fixed, you can't just go out and double the amount of space to accommodate your social distancing. It just doesn't really pencil out. So, there are some specialized environments, right? Like your CGMP facilities, and the continuity of operations on those sides actually have a higher likelihood of kind of moving forward. I was sharing with one of our colleagues. One of my nephews actually works for Alcon Labs on the manufacturing side. You know, they do a lot of the contacts and other things, and he's like, you know, we're totally gowned up on the floor. You know, they're walking in and out of the environment. They're being tested before they go in. So a lot of the protocols are already in place for some of these kind of manufacturing related facilities. They have directional HEPA filtered air. Sterility is sort of built in the environment, especially in clean room facilities, another where, you know, dirt is kind of the devil. But the considerations about how you maybe go about predicting impacts and tracing and doing, you know, worker temperature controls may be really important as you move forward. The manufacturing floor, as I said, you know, if you're dealing with a clean room facility where you're doing microchip processing or something along those lines, the air infiltration is you know, probably very highly controlled because dust is the enemy there. But they could also be a slightly more complicated than maybe a CGMP facility where you don't have all the kind of same protocols in place, because all manufacturing is not the same, right? If you're dealing with nanomaterials versus a clean room environment where you're dealing with you know, wafer fab production and chip development versus, you know, an aeronautics environment where you may not have that same level of kind of clean space, you're going to have to treat your spaces differently. So in that plant manufacturing areas, you may need to make some efforts to spread out workers as much as possible. And in some cases, that may just moving where some of this workstations are located around that might have limitations due to equipment and spacing. But there are probably going to have to also be more policy and operational changes. And then, you know, consider those employees that are even associated with the manufacturing facility that can still be in a work from home environment as well. We pulled together one case study, which I thought was kind of an interesting, I don't know, Steve, you may know these guys from Omaha, from your time back up in that neck of the woods, but Elemental Science Incorporation is a 20-year-old plus Omaha-based company with about 600 or 700 employees all around the world that are mostly focused on testing and equipment manufacturing components that go to a variety of fabrication and laboratory environments. And interesting, now Nebraska is one of the places I think that didn't shut down like a lot of our states had, but they did not suspend any of their work operations through the entire pandemic. They were considered, I guess, a critical industry, at least by their state, and they did not have that stay-at-home order. There were obviously concerns about supply chains issues, but they have not seen any major disruptions. And as they thought about their protocols in their manufacturing and production environments, they were taking lessons learned. You know, much like we have within Perkins and Will, we've been looking at what some of the models have been going on in our Shanghai office as we're modeling how we began to look at our reopen office strategies within our firm globally. And, you know, have our dashboards that are monitoring, you know, our partial and incremental reopening of the offices. But they required 100% use of face mask for all of their employees from the time you exited your car until you basically returned to that environment, even in the parking lot. They actually modified one of their machines to actually produce the IPA that would have the antimicrobial wipes. So he said everybody has those all the time. And then one thing that they did in anticipation of supply chain disruption is they upstocked on their raw materials and supplies that they were afraid might be disrupted. And so they kind of built up their inventory of those materials that they thought that they would need for manufacturing, but then also noticing anticipating what the likely disrupting downstream might look like. They tried to draw down their produced product inventory so they didn't have a $2 to $3 million device sitting around in their inventory area when they had difficulty in perhaps delivering to some of their university and industry clients. So kind of stocking up on raw materials, but trying to stock down on their product inventory. So as we look at this kind of more to the mid to long-term strategy, we realize that one thing that has already become really fundamental to the operations of these R&D environments is acceleration. So it's a trend that was already occurring that I think we anticipate is going to just proliferate further within the light of our COVID anticipation or COVID impacts. Just like Jessica was saying, we've all become much more skilled at our inner dynamics and working in virtual communications and meetings. I think we're going to see an acceleration of a lot of the automation throughputs that we've seen. So, things that have been happening, and the examples of those are like, high throughput imaging, blood testing, automation, all those things that can use, desktop automation or even robotics or computer modeling, so that you're, instead of testing 25 mice at a time, or 10 at a time, you might be doing 25 instead of, filling one vial at a time, you might be filling 30. So using those automation will provide some opportunities and what we think will be some long-term impacts to what we have. So big takeaway is, and the whole purpose of us having our peer-to-peer conversation is, we're all in this together. This has been unlike anything I think any of us have ever experienced before. Has really touched so many folks around the globe in so many different ways, and so we're all trying to share and exchange information, and we're grateful to share a little bit of our thoughts and research and what we're hearing from some of our clients with you, and are interested to hear some of your feedback as well.
Great. Thanks, Stefan and Jessica. I have a question, and then I'm going to just ask, if you have questions, you could use the chat, but I think we have a small enough group that you could just unmute yourself and ask a question. But, and this is for either of the Perkins Will folks. You talked towards the end a lot about the air quality in lab space, BSL ones, and we've had that for a long time. But, I think increasingly it's become clear that transmission is through the air, and maybe not so much as through surfaces as we might have thought. And so what is the right response for cleaning office air? Because to me, that's like the #1 thing in terms of, we can't throw in new HVAC systems right away. Are there some strategies on helping have healthier air in just general workplaces?
Well, I'll kind of respond initially and then let Jessica sort of dial in. I think a lot of the near-term issues are going to have to be through other means of control, because we can't just go in and wholesale replace our mechanical systems in our office spaces. And so they're going to have to be behavioral in nature, and limiting occupancy, or using PPE and other things in important ways. I think it's fascinating as we're all kind of been exchanging ideas around this. When you think about the Great Fire of London and a lot of policies that have come out of even the way we look at zoning and city policies, a lot of the things that we've had have come out of public health crisis or other major kind of disaster events that have eventually become codified. So when we think about occupancy limitations on auditorium, and when we look at our office spaces and think about our means of egress and our requirements for stairwells and so on and so forth, have obviously been framed into our regulatory environment over time based on byproducts of major health crises. So we anticipate that there will likely be implications to our codes as we move forward over time that will become, just like a lot of our codes, there'll be things that'll be incrementally grandfathered and new things that'll come online that will require upgrades and improvements when renovations are taking place. But in the interim, I think there's a high likelihood of using kind of personnel and behavioral controls to deal with some of those. Jessica, if you have to add.
I think one insight we have is that, as Stephen mentioned earlier, we've been collaborating on this return to campus with many of our other practices, K-12 planning and strategies, as well as our healthcare team. And our healthcare team has had experience over the last several months converting closed hospitals to COVID-19 response centers. And I've tapped them about this specifically because I had a client call me asking about ventilation. I was like, dude, I'm an architect, I'm not an engineer, I apologize, but let me dig into and see what I can do. And our healthcare team has been working with engineers, and one website they pointed us to is that ASHRAE actually has guidance for building operations during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you probably are already aware of it, but if not, that guideline, that guidebook has a framework for some simple strategies to deal with ventilation, not only by de-densifying, as Stephen mentioned, but just simply turning off some demand controlled ventilation and circulating at a higher rate. So that just might be a place to start, and working with your engineering teams in the buildings of strategies that can help in the short term, and then potentially in the mid to long term.
Well, great. So any of the peers on the peer-to-peer, does anyone want to unmute themselves and just ask a question?
Or does anybody have a response different or additional to what Brian suggested?
I had a question, actually. Do you think that the need for automation that you referred to in lab processes will lead to more demand for biomanufacturing facilities? I mean, I know that's an area of high demand currently.
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I'm probably the best person to answer that. I think we've seen an interesting acceleration in the acceleration kinds of processes, if I can say it that way. And I think as we begin to think about, as we are trying to consider approaches to minimize the impact and disruption, because a lot of what's going to come out of the conversation and the experience of this COVID event is how do we structure our operations, our facilities, our workspaces for our employees to be more resilient moving forward. So we do a lot of resilience work, and I think back to some of the planning work that I've done, where we've gone through some resiliency planning workshops with our clients, where we talk about what some of the acute some of the chronic stressors and some of the acute shocks that might happen along the way, and we play a little card exercise, and one of them is usually the pandemic card. And people will say, well, it has a high likelihood, it would have a high impact in terms of negative influence, but the likelihood is quite low. And it's funny because we've been going back and pulling a lot of those out from our planning exercises and sort of seeing where people had put pandemic and they were really kind of like low likelihood size. And obviously that hasn't been the case most recently. So I think the reality and the response to your question is how we respond, and in terms of acceleration and automation is going to have a lot to do with how our business, research, and manufacturing operations can be more resilient to what is potentially a high likelihood of a recurrence of this kind of an event moving forward. Somebody else may have something to add to that.
Well, I'll just jump in. I think on a policy standpoint, this has demonstrated our reliance, the U.S. reliance on manufacturing overseas. So I do think with initiatives like Nimble, and if you pay attention on the federal level, there's a number of funding proposals to increase manufacturing, particularly for biopharmaceuticals. So if some of those pass, I do think you're going to see an increased intention on more drug manufacturing, at least in the U.S., at least try to do that. Whether that's practical or not is, economically going to be challenging. But so I do see in that narrow area the interests of the United States, at least in terms of reshoring some of biomanufacturing.
It goes back to that supply chain thing that we were talking about as well, right, Brian?
Right.
I mean, we heard the whole conversation where, we sent a bunch of our supplies over to China, and then everybody's coming back and saying, well, where are our stockpiles? You send them overseas. And so just in time delivery and being able to scale up on that manufacturing, I think is a real good question moving forward.
So anyone else want to ask a question?
Brian, this is Ursula. I'd love to ask a question if possible.
Please, Ursula.
All right. Look, I'm even gonna turn my camera on.
Wow.
I'm zoomed out in terms of video. So, hi, Stephen.
Hi.
And Jessica. It was really helpful to hear your presentation. So, as you guys, I think I'm with Ancora, and actually this is very timely because over the last few weeks I've been talking with a lot of folks in the real estate and design industry about what flex space, really that whole continuum of co-working to sort of shorter term lease office space might look like, and sort of separating out what the immediate sort of actions are, during the pandemic, and what might shake out 2 years from now, which is actually we're about to design a space that is a fairly significant flex office space, but it won't come online for another 2 years. So these are just a few random things I've heard, and I'd love to hear what you think will persist, over a 24-month period. One is that I heard this very much from industry real estate people, which is don't count on significant de-densification because employers are not going to want to pay for 150 square foot or 200 square feet per person. It may not be as kind of modest as it's been trending. If anything, it may reinforce the demand for flex space so that employers, whether large or small, then have the ability to adjust their office footprint depending on how many people are in the space. I heard a lot of people have been talking about the ventilation sort of issue, and that may be something that does persist, and that people are going to look at more sophisticated air filtration systems. And then the other thing that some folks thought would persist for the longer run is sort of voice-activated commands and, essentially touchless door opening, that sort of thing. So do you have any sense of whether those things will sort of become longer run? And is there anything else?
I can jump in quickly, Ursula, and then Stephen can follow up. Great question, because we have heard this one before. So I actually pulled up a list that our team had started to brainstorm, and you hit a couple of those already. So I think if you have a project that's in design or kind of thinking ahead to the future, again, we have no crystal ball. We have no idea what it's going to look like in 2 years. But I think some things to consider. You had mentioned the benefits of integrated sensors and smart building technologies. So how does that impact you as an employee as you move throughout the building, throughout the day, and how you conduct your work? Assessing future use of remote working and the associated space impact. So, work from home has proven for most that it is possible. Now, I think people will be in your buildings and they will be on campuses, but I think there still is going to be this hybrid approach for a very long time. And also, if those that are remote do come to the office, they may want a more enclosed space. So smaller two-person rooms throughout your building might be a need. Considering new functions and space types. So something like a health screening area. If you're going to start taking temperatures of every single person every single day, because of HIPAA, does that have to be done out in the open, or do you have to have a health screening area off to the side that's conducted in? Investigating new materials for evidence-based health properties and performance with increased cleaning. I think materiality of what you select and that health performance is key. And then you mentioned already ventilation, but enhanced criteria for infrastructure. It's not just ventilation, but humidity control, plumbing, indoor air quality. So that was just a quick list we had brainstormed. I think you touched on several of those, but I think they will evolve over time as they're probably, as Stephen mentioned early on, if there's an echo in this pandemic or some other pandemic hits, that's part of the resiliency that needs to be built in.
I think one of the super exciting things is when we think about research parks and innovation districts, they seem to be the place where change is constant, right? Paradigms are ever changing, and there are new trends that are inevitable, and but innovators feed on change, and innovation spaces and communities of innovation are really the birthplace of our most disruptive technologies. And so I think a lot of us are really kind of looking to to each of us that are here in this participant group that are kind of looking at how things are going to be trending moving forward, because the kind of creative design and engineering related organizations that comprise your parks are going to be some of the first and earliest adapters. They'll be the ones most likely to embrace acceleration, automation, online tools, and other kinds of things for information exchange. And that might actually, in some places, increase the level of collaboration amongst us. But I think one question that a lot of the folks that I've been interacting with have been asking is, well, is this going to mean that we're not going to have these common spaces? Because we've heard from the marketplace that a lot of real estate brokers out there are hearing a lot more inquiries about the suburban office parks, and they're saying they're getting more inquiries than they've heard in the last decade. Because folks are maybe concerned about workers traveling on the train to come into work, or long commutes and the like, and providing flexibility to their workforce. And we've seen people come down on both sides of the fence. You have to work in the office, and you have to come back to the office, and that's our intention, to get back there, to, hey, maybe we want to move to a complete virtual environment. But I think when we bring it back to this kind of innovation exchange area, I think one of the things we have to talk about is that at the core of our humanity lies this need for social interaction. And I think a lot of us are starting to starve on that a little bit right now. And it's the spaces and places that we design into our research parks that are spaces that some of you heard me say I refer to as the bumpability spaces, that are designed to foster those, with purpose, accidental interaction. And those are the pause points on the stairwells, or the cafes, or the outdoor spaces that are very communal in nature. And so how we began to shift our behaviors, how we think about cleaning, how we think about vaccination and other kinds of approaches are going to reshape protocols and behaviors. But at the end of the day, if you ask my opinion about that, I think, just not unlike the Spanish flu aftermath, we had the roaring 20s, right? People were starving to come back together and interact. And I think we have to do that with caution. We have to plan with resilience and anticipation, and be thoughtful and deliberate about it. And I think the environments in our AURP constituency are where I think we can see some of the most disruptive and innovative applications of this space.
Great, thank you.
Additional questions out there? The one thing I noticed, I think it was on Jessica or Stephen's, it's the source. It said it was 2013, pandemic response to influenza. So from the World Health Organization. So, I mean, at least they were planning, somebody was out there planning a pandemic response back in 2013. Will you be able to share with us these slides, as well as this? You mentioned you have a different slide set for reopening higher ed. Will you be able to share those with us?
Sure, we could do that. Yes.
Okay, because I think both would be of interest, because many of us, work with our are part of higher ed institutions, and everyone's struggling with many of the same topics, except it's going to be much more complicated, I think, reopening a campus versus with dorms and dining halls, et cetera, than reopening an office. But
yeah, we've had some of our research part clients that said, can we get you in touch with our campus architect and campus planner? Because I think that might be helpful as well. I'm curious, you've heard a lot from us, but I'm really kind of curious from this group, what others of you are experiencing in your parks, and what kind of hurdles have you run into that are, or walls have you run into, or really, base hits or home runs or wonderful successes that you could share with the group? Steve, pick on someone.
As soon as I can get unmuted here. It's been a mishmash. We're hurtling down the pathway of reopening campus July 6th. I'll tell you, everyone's scared to death about it, but we're trying to figure out how best to do that. Two of the issues that we have run into have to do with liability. We've been told we can't test third parties. If there are employees, that's one thing, even that has some connotations. And we can't mandate the use of face masks. Well, we can strongly encourage it. I'll tell you, the latter has been accepted very readily on a voluntary basis by folks who are coming into work. But it's going to be kind of edging our way along to see how far are we allowed to go in trying to provide for the common good.
Who else? Laura? I know you guys have been talking a lot about this, right?
Yes, we have. I'm sorry, the question was, remind me the question.
What kind of challenges have you guys run into, or walls have you hit, or what kind of base hits or home runs or wonderful successes can you share?
I think just continuously having the conversation and acknowledging that it keeps changing is a good policy. Ignoring it and because you don't know what the guidance is not a good policy. So just being transparent about the fact that these things are changing constantly. We're trying to stay on top of what are national trends, and we appreciate Perkins and Will and Jessica came and presented to a group of our corporate sites, so that was great. But the state has its guidance. The state guidance has changed multiple times from what we've been told it was going to be to then what it is. So anyway, we just kind of are trying to do our best to put out what we've seen our best practices broadly, and then supplement with what the policies are that are coming out. But just continuing to have the conversation, and it may seem repetitive, but the reason for the repetitiveness is just because it's constantly changing.
I love the transparency remark, because what is it that anybody wants, right? If you're a developer that's trying to build, you want to know what the rules are so you know what you're pushing up against. If you're a healthcare institution, you want to know what the rules are so you can plan out your models. And everybody right now is wondering to know what the playbook, what the rule book looks like. And the reality is we don't know. And I think what you said is a really key word there, is just being transparent about the fact that things are changing and everybody's doing the best they can, and we're kind of like that last slide, we're kind of all in this together is really key. Anybody else?
I was wondering if Greg King and Mary Hunter being in Atlanta could offer up any words of wisdom.
Sometimes you have to turn off your camera and mute your phone and go get a snack. What about Aaron?
One of the challenges we're facing is the value proposition. We have companies that are suddenly, they've realized they can work from home. They don't need the space that they had before. And we have other companies that are simply not threatening to move out, but are considering moving out. And it's just the aggravation of whatever rules we put into place as people come back to the park. And so I think reestablishing the value proposition of being in the park and making it clear that we're not going to be too restrictive as these companies come back in, and it's in their best interest, is really the critical piece for us. But I would also like to hear what other folks, how they're communicating with their tenants as well.
Looks like we got Greg, at least he turned his camera on. Comments, Greg?
Well, I feel like the kid that got called on in school who was doing something he shouldn't have been doing during class. I had to step away for a phone call, and I heard, well, something blah 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 Atlanta, and I'm like, oh dang.
Well, we said so. Sometimes you mute your phone and you turn your screen off. You have to go get a snack.
Well, right? It's not that I haven't done that, but in this case, I was actually answering a phone call. But so what was the question? I don't know that I can be insightful and brilliant.
The question was just what are you experiencing? You know, what walls have you run into, or hardships or major challenges that you just might want to share with the group and see if anybody else has been experiencing, or what base hits or home runs or amazing successes have you
Yeah, so from the university side, we're like all universities, we're looking at our research continuity and tracking those things. One of the things that has been pretty encouraging is that that has still remained strong. With respect to Tech Square, it's really interesting. We're still seeing companies looking to come into Tech Square and co-locate with us, even as companies are trying to determine what that looks like for them, right? What does that look like? What does coming back look like? How are you protecting your employees? We had a discussion recently about in some of our buildings, and Vicki, I think we may have talked about this on another call, but where does the responsibility lie in keeping people safe during reentry? Because I mean, that's the big psychological issue. It's being able to keep people safe. But for example, when you come into a building, you can social distance in an elevator. And like if Stephen and I are on the elevator and Brian comes up, whose responsibility is it to say, Brian, go get another elevator? Or, or does Brian know that? And Brian does that himself. And so I think that from the Tech Square side, I think there's going to be a lot of social dynamics that are going to play into the success of people coming back in. We have companies that have been telling us anyway, they're planning, that they have their plan for coming back and doing reentry and staggering their work plans and staggering their research and doing those types of efforts. But also, they're also planning for what happens when version 2.0 of COVID-19 hits, and how will they step back into remote work following that. So anyway, those are just a couple of thoughts.
Okay, I think we're going to have to cut it off there because we're a little bit past the 3 o'clock hour. We have a number of people drop off. A number of people have additional Zoom calls coming up. I know you want to get to those. So just a reminder, next week we will not have the peer-to-peer because we will have the BioHealth Caucus, June 2nd and 3rd, 2 to 4 p.m. If you haven't signed up, please sign up. We got a great set of speakers from a variety of groups, including 6 biohealth innovation districts across the country, the head of Alexandria Real Estate, and a number of other great speakers. So don't come to peer-to-peer, come to sign up for the Biohealth Caucus, and we can send you out information if you don't have it. The following week, if somebody wants to volunteer, like we had with our colleagues from Perkins and Will, please let us know and we'll bring you in as a host. And I want to thank, Diana there. Diana has put up, thank you, Diana, the, our summary of the Biohealth Caucus. So with that, I think we will conclude. I want to thank again, Stefan and Jessica for a great presentation on the, some insights from Perkins and Will. And we will see you either at the Biohealth Caucus or at the following week for the normal time for the peer-to-peer. So with that, again, thank you. And we will get out the slides that have generously been provided by Perkins and Will to all of you so you can share them with your stakeholders. And again, demonstrating the value of being an AURP member. So with that, I will say goodbye to everyone and stay safe. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks
Thank
everyone.
you, Steve. Thanks, Jessica. It was
Yeah.
really interesting. Really
Thanks.
interesting. I think it could have gone a long longer.